I'm Sue Ball, and I'm the chair of the Thorney Island Society. Some of you, in fact, many of you will know that Greg isn't a stranger because he's led many Thorny Island talks around St James's Park and Thorny Island and the Green Park. So that's very special. He was doing that when he was the tree officer for the Royal Parks. And these were delightful occasions, and he would have been doing a walk with us in St James's Park had we not had the odd situation that we're in now. But currently, Greg is the tree officer with Islington Council, but I'm really delighted that he's come back to us on Thorny Island, especially to give us his presentation about the trees and elements of the history of trees of St James's Park. I mean, Greg is an old friend of ours and many of yours too, and he's going to be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. And so we'll be following his directions from here on in, and I'd like to welcome you, Greg, and over to you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm Greg. Used to work for the Royal Parks, so I spent 4 years there in the tree department. Yeah, I left just over a year ago, which is a very sad decision, but sort of correct. Can anyone else hear that doorbell noise, or is it just me? I'm not sure. We're not sure where it's coming from. Anyway, so.
I think it's people joining in, Greg, so apologies for that.
Okay, it's not me going. Okay.
No.
Yeah, sorry. So it was just the right career move. It was very sad because you honestly can't beat working at the Royal Parks or spending any time in the Royal Parks. So giving presentations is something that I quite enjoy. I've done quite a few tree walks. This year I've kind of become a little more comfortable with Zoom presentations than I'd ever anticipated. But I'll be totally honest, the lead up to this presentation has been a bit of a disaster because all manner of work situations has been very, very difficult. So it's a slightly different presentation than I originally had in mind, because I just haven't quite had the chance to properly research everything as much as I wanted to. So I'm doing. It's still about St James's Park. We're still about the tree history of St James's Park. It's just a little different than perhaps I had planned. I don't know if anybody saw the St James's Park tree walk that I did for the Urban Tree Festival back in May. So this is kind of based on that to a degree, but I don't like giving the same presentation twice, really. I like to try and make it different for every group. So if you want to see that, that's on the Urban Tree Festival YouTube site. But yes, yeah, so this will be a bit different. So I'm going to go on to screen share. And right, so sort of starting off with a map of the area, really. So what I will be sort of referring back to the St James's Park tree walk map, because it's quite a good illustration of the park. And also I've got a few slides to be showing you, so there may be a bit of jumping about between screens, but hopefully it won't be too annoying. So St James's Park, it's by landmass, it's the smallest park because quite a bit of St James's Park is actually the lake. And it's also the oldest rural park, from what I understand. I think most people think the oldest rural park is either Richmond Park or Greenwich, but I suppose in terms of geology, they're all effectively the same age, but as an actual designated enclosed rural park, then St James's is the oldest. And it's surrounded by 3 palaces, Buckingham Palace here, St James's Palace here, where it gets its name, and just over here, off the map, Westminster Palace. Now, I'm sort of starting off covering the entire time period before the 16th century, which is thousands of years effectively, but that kind of, the land usage can be sort of grouped into one band. And pre-16th century, and there's a reason why, I'll explain in a minute why I'm starting at the 16th century and before that, is because back then, the whole area, and if we sort of go to the Google map, so this whole area, completely different to what we know now, it was all remote swamp, a remote boggy, swampy marshland and flooding water meadow that was part of the Tyburn tributary that flowed into the Thames. And the river of the Tyburn sort of ran through Green Park. Allegedly, it actually there's a marker along the central avenue marking where the location of the Tyburn is or was, that sort of flowed in through Green Park, through St James's and into the Thames. And seasonally, the river would flood and it would create create a marshland effectively, which wasn't ideal for settlement. And pre-Roman times, there was only really one small settlement that was known as the town of the Tribunates, I think, or something along those lines, which when the Romans came, that became Londinium and what we now call the City of London. So way back then, pre-Roman times, there was just very little settlement around here. And very relevant to this group, this area was known as the Thorny Island because it was a series of small islands in a river, and this is the first indication of the tree history, is that it was a collection of islands covered in thorn, either blackthorn or hawthorn. And I think the main Thorny Island relates to this particular area, but in reality, large areas of these would have been lots and lots of small islands in the rivers, the streams and the boggy marshes. And there was very little settlement over the centuries, apart from the occasional farm. But the first main kind of land use and settlement came in the 13th century with St James's Hospital, which was a hospital for female lepers, and it was named after St James for Less. And that, of course, is in the modern day area of St James's Palace. And pre-20th century, definitely, I don't really know if there's been a disease that has as much stigma attached to it as leprosy. So on the whole, people avoided other people, avoided lepers and areas of lepers. So for a long time, it was largely left untouched. So it was actually quite a good area for wildlife, by all accounts. And at this time, the dominant tree cover would have been pioneer species such as birch, pine and hazel. And then lastly, that would have been followed by lime, alder and willow. And because of the wetness of the area, more than likely the area would have been dominated by willow and alder trees, because these are trees that thrive along riverbanks and damp habitats. They're specialised to grow in wet areas, and they're trees that struggle to grow from seed. So what they do is they naturally drop branches, which can sort of flow downriver, land in sort of settle in banks of mud, and then sort of grow their own roots to produce a new tree. So their entire evolutionary strategy is based on being in these wetland habitats. And due to the farmsteads of the time, it more than likely would have been a coppiced landscape of willow. So for those unfamiliar, coppicing is when it should come to, here you go. So this image here, well, this is kind of halfway between a coppice and a pollard. But a coppice is when you cut a tree, a younger tree, completely down at the base or a low height, and you get this very elongated vertical regrowth. And pre-industrial revolution, this is largely what the industry at the time would have been built on, this coppice. Taller trees done in the same way is referred to as pollarding. And really the main difference is that pollarding is at height to prevent the regrowth being browse. And if I go to the first, okay, so this image here. So this is what one of the products of coppicing would look like. So you've got all these weaved branches. So the younger growth, especially from willow, is very flexible but quite strong. And they would use larger branches, such as these here, as stakes. And the smaller branches to weave fencing, and in this example here, that's where they've reinforced the riverbank. And
so seeing what you're seeing, I don't know. I've still got the pollarded avenue.
oh, okay. I don't know why that hasn't changed. So you can't see it the PowerPoint image.
No, I can see the tree, the pollarded example that you showed, the photograph of the wet.
Okay, so
track.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see it on the PowerPoint now?
I think it's
no, it's not.
We seem to be stuck on the avenue.
Okay, I don't know why that's done that. Oh, I think I know what I've done. Okay, bear with me 2 secs. I'm going to come out of screen share and go back in. Sorry about this. This hasn't actually happened to me before. Can you see that now?
There, yes. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I don't know why that happened. That hasn't happened to me before, actually. So in this example, you can see you've got these stakes, these wooden stakes, and then the weaved branches are weaved around the stakes, and then that's reinforcing the riverbank. And think before metal casting, before ironworks, when stone and rocks were too big for ordinary people to move about and to carve, the entire industry and infrastructure was built from wooden products. And the product of coppicing, depending on what size you cut it, would sort of determine what it would be used for. So very, very small, sort of 1, 2 or 3 years worth of regrowth. You could use it for thatched roofing. You could use it for insulation, for bedding. Slightly larger, you'd use it for sort of fences like this. So this would be used to mark out sort of livestock pens and boundary markers. Larger would be more for sort of construction purposes, for tools, for weapons, for charcoal. And then the larger trees would be used for timber. So yes, at the time, I think the landscape may well have been a coppice landscape of predominantly willow, alder and hazel. And then they probably have standard trees of oak and elm, and they'd be the standards, like big mature maiden trees that would eventually be cut down for larger timber or firewood. So I'm gonna have to come back out of screen share. I think I know. Right, so if I do the main screen, come out of this. Right, are we back on? So can you now see the St. James's Park map?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I think I might have, rather than, okay, I worked out what I did wrong. Okay, right, so I think that general landscape usage would probably have covered several thousand years up to the 16th century, with obviously varying changes from the Romans, the Saxons, the Danes, up to the Normans. But again, I think because of the nature of the St. James's Hospital and the lepers, then ultimately I think the area would have largely been left alone, which would have given a lot of continuity to the habitat and the landscape. But as we move into the 16th century, of course, Henry VIII comes in. And Henry VIII, amongst other sort of hobbies of his, deer hunting was one of his real obsessions. And something that always makes me chuckle is I've read a number of references claiming that Henry VIII acquired land, which is quite a liberal interpretation of how he got his land. But he sort of acquired the land around what became St. James's, and he used it as a deer breeding park. So going back to the Google map, so in the 1530s, you've got the Palace of Westminster here, where the Royal Court was, and then all of this predominantly would be a wooded landscape. And Kensington Gardens didn't exist until the 1730s, so this was all Hyde Park. Bayswater and Oxford Street were old Roman roads, so this was the original boundary marking of what is Hyde Park. All down here would have been part of that wooded landscape, and then up to Regent's Park was all wooded as well. And because these were sort of, so the area of Hyde Park and the area of what is Regent's Park was sort of preferred hunting grounds. At that point, when he wasn't at Hampton Court or Greenwich, Henry VIII was sometimes based around Westminster Palace. And this was a very convenient area for him to go hunting. And of course, they needed a good, reliable, secure supply to breed their deer. So Henry VIII sort of took control of this general land, because originally in Hyde Park there was a monastery that they abolished. And Henry VIII built a hunting lodge, or had a hunting lodge built around the St James. It was St James's Hunting Lodge. And then the deer were raised in St James's Park, and then that probably would have been enclosed with sort of wooden paling. And the land management then, we would now look at that as being quite progressive, because rather than going in and planting lots of trees, they actually sort of sat back and favoured natural regeneration. And at the moment, sort of natural regeneration and rewilding has become a really, really sort of key part of landscape restoration. And yeah, sort of inadvertently, Henry VIII was an unlikely pioneer of rewilding and natural regeneration, which is perhaps not what I expected to find out from Henry VIII when looking into this. And then for the next sort of 70 years or so, it predominantly stayed as hunting ground. I mean, during the time of Elizabeth I especially, kind of Hyde Park, especially on the parade ground, became, well, someone's off mute there, became more sort of for military usage and sort of pomp and ceremony, as well as areas of St James's. But it wasn't until the 17th century when James I came in, and he started to really do drastic alterations to the landscape of St James's. And that's kind of where the more familiar landscape starts to originate. So what would have the area would have been like? There wasn't a single continuous body of water. Over here near Buckingham Palace, there was a big pond called Rosamond's Pond, and then over this way there would have been sort of smaller lakes for fish, and they also installed duck decoys to attract in ducks so they could hunt the ducks. And this is where the origins of the mall and birdcage walk come in. So James I had these two roads installed, and of course birdcage walk was so named because that was used to house the collection of James I's exotic animals, such as elephants, crocodiles and camels were kept in the park, which is quite the departure from the squirrels, herons, parakeets and moorhens that we see today. Although the pelicans, which came a few years later, are still, well, that legacy is still there. But from a tree perspective, and this is where it gets quite amusing, in like a proper sort of Schadenfreude-esque way, is that from the 14th century onwards, France and especially Italy were building up international reputations for their sort of trade, especially in silk. And James I kind of wanted to try and establish sort of the English monopoly, or try and build an English monopoly on silk. So between 1609 and 1610, he had over 10,000 mulberry trees planted, because the mulberry silk moth, which produces the silk, lives on mulberries. So they had 10,000 trees planted, and a lot of the area between Buckingham Palace, the south of St James's Park, and all the way down into kind of Victoria Way, would have been planted with over 10,000 mulberries. Now the problem is that the silk moth lives on the white mulberry tree, Morus alba, and they planted exclusively black mulberries, which is Morus nigra, which is actually a far better tree suited for the UK landscape, but it was a spectacular mistake of epic proportions. And that legacy is still kind of with us today, because this area of St James's Park, at tree number 13, is on a site called Mulberry Hill. And there's a collection of mulberries here, mostly black mulberries and one paper mulberry. But also in the grounds of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Gardens is the National Mulberry Collection, which that collection sort of spans from Kensington Gardens, Kensington Palace Gardens into Hyde Park. There's one tree on Wellington roundabout, and then down into St James's Park through Buckingham Palace. So that legacy is still there. Another accidental byproduct of that is that it actually helped conserve the black mulberry in the UK. So despite popular belief at times, I say popular, it's still quite niche actually, James I didn't introduce the mulberry to England. It came over with the Romans, it was believed. And the sort of fossil records that have found mulberry seeds in Roman sort of cookery stuff, and archaeologists found it or whatever. And in the days of monasteries and abbeys, the mulberry was quite a popular tree planted in the garden because it's a fruiting tree. And of course, in the time of Henry VIII, the monasteries were destroyed and the land was razed. So a byproduct of Henry VIII's time was that he almost potentially wiped out the black mulberry from England without realising. And then again, without realising, James I managed to re-establish the tree. So sometimes these big mistakes can actually have quite good results and end products. Now, after the Civil War, moving into the days of Oliver Cromwell in the Commonwealth, sorry, I should say before that, I sort of jumped over Charles I because tree-wise, I couldn't find anything significant that Charles I did, except he opened up the parks such as St James's Park and Hyde Park to the public for the first time. So more members of the public were able to use those parks, and Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans objected to anything that was remotely fun. So they banned the public from going into the park, for leisure and recreation activities, and also the finances were in a really, really bad condition after the Civil War. And to recover some money, they sold off Hyde Park. One of the big examples of public asset stripping, and they allowed the public to come into St James's Park to cut down the trees to use as firewood. So this was really the first mass deforestation of the St James's Park area. And also during this time, St James's Park fell into disrepair and became a bit of a wasteland and a hotbed for crime. But that didn't last too long, because in the 1660s, Charles II returned from exile to retake the throne. And during his time in exile in France, he spent a lot of time in sort of the French palatial gardens. So he was kind of inspired by the landscaping of Versailles. So he came back and he brought back, I'm rubbish with pronunciations, but I'm assuming André Mollet, the French garden designer, either that or Andrew Mollett if he was English. And they started to create new pathways and avenues and planted hundreds of trees. And it was also during this time that the canal was designed and established. If I jump to the PowerPoint, so this is St James's Palace here. I'm not too sure what's happened with this green line, if you can see that. But so this is André Mollet's landscape design of St James's, what would be St James's Park. And you can see here we've got this very long, narrow canal. And this was a double tree-lined avenue, which is very grand. And you can also see very, very regimented rows, straight lines. And this would have been hundreds and hundreds of trees. So a lot of these avenues would have predominantly been oak, elm and lime trees. But down here as well would have been a large orchard. And here in St James's Palace, I don't know if you can make these out. These are two little tree dots here. And there were supposed to be two grand oak trees planted in the grounds of St James's Palace. Now, sadly, they're no longer there. But in the 4 years that I worked at the Royal Parks, just odd emails would come in from members of the public asking if those trees still existed. So they kind of developed a bit of a folklore and a mystique about them. So yeah, sorry. So as was the time, or was of the time, it was a very regimented, formal design landscape. And if you compare the park to how it is now, so this is Birdcage Walk. So all this area has been lost to the park, and the park kind of cuts off about here. So this is now Horse Guards Road, and then this area would be Horse Guards Parade. Then of course this area here would be the Victoria Borders, and of course the canal is the lake. It's very, very different. But also part of this area was designated as a recreational ground as well. And this here, this is from Rest Park in Bedfordshire, which I believe is the Capability Brown landscape. And I'm using this as an example because it's the best example I could find of how that canal might have looked with that tree-lined landscape. Although I don't think there was a feature like this at the end. Now coming back onto the next, back to here. Okay, so moving into the 18th century now, which was the time of the oranges. So the Royal Court at that point it hadn't become Buckingham Palace yet. It was still mainly Westminster Palace. And William and Mary didn't like the sort of hustle and bustle of Westminster down here. So they moved off to what would have been a quiet suburb just outside of London, of Kensington. And they acquired what was supposed to be quite a nice villa known as Nottingham House, which is of course today Kensington Palace. And when the Royal Court moved towards Kensington Palace in the 1730s, Queen Caroline decided that she wanted to redesign Hyde Park to make it a nicer place. And this of course is when Hyde Park got separated and Kensington Gardens was designed with Charles Bridgeman, the garden designer. Now, because the landscape focus shifted to Kensington Gardens, St James's Park once again started to become neglected and came into disrepair. And it was considered to not be a very nice place because the grass was overgrown, the plants and shrubs were overgrown, trees were dying, and the canal turned stagnant. In sort of today's world, overgrown grass and plants and dead trees is kind of what we sometimes want to encourage for habitat value, but with the hangover of that very formal, regimented, controlled landscape, it was seen as a real sort of fall from grace of the time. And then once again, St James's Park became a real hotbed for crime. And this is kind of one of the interesting stories of the Royal Parks, is that in order to get from Kensington Palace to Parliament, they had to cross through this whole area, which was still a bit almost like bandit territory. So this is when they built the King's Road, or the Route de Roi, which is Rotten Row as it is now. And that was the first ever street lamp lined road. And that was built to get the King to Parliament through Hyde Park and across Green Park and St James's. But part of Queen Caroline's designs with Charles Bridgeman included the planting of over 25,000 trees across Kensington Gardens, Hyde Park, Green Park and St James's Park. And this sort of, it kept of the time with the kind of the native plantings, but it's where we started to see the introduction of trees such as the horse chestnut, ornamental trees such as copper beech, and a real favourite of Charles Bridgeman was planting sweet chestnuts and walnut. And although we know St James's Park is predominantly a sort of a London plain dominated landscape like we can see here, the main trees of the time were actually elm trees. Now, I'll show you some images, well, obviously not photos from the 18th century, but paintings later on. Yeah, sorry. So the 18th century saw predominantly a time of neglect and decay for St James's Park. But that all changed in the 19th century. So you can almost see from the sort of 16th century onwards, it went on like a 100-year cycle of being good, bad for the park. But in the 19th century, the Prince Regent commissioned John Nash to redesign the park in a much more natural and romantic landscape. And this is where the familiar landscape that we know today comes from. If I go back to the presentation, so this is John Nash's design. So you can see it's almost more or less the same, effectively. I mean, obviously things change. Things have changed in the last 100, 200 years or so. But the actual, the lake, I mean, obviously this bit is, the lake is completed. The pathways are still the same as well. And they changed straight lines to curved edges, and the canal became the curved lake. And again, in keeping with the times, they started to remove flower beds and focused on shrubberies. But for the rest of the 19th century, it saw mass planting of the London plane, because the London plane, a hybrid tree, wasn't planted in London until the 1660s, but there's only a very small number of London plane planted then. Then there was a bit of a wave of plantings in the late 18th century, but the actual plane trees that we see in St James's Park weren't really planted until the 1880s onwards. And that was because this was in the Industrial Revolution, all coal powered, so the air of London was really heavily polluted. There were very, very few trees that could actually survive in London because of the polluted air. One of the reasons why very few conifers survived in London was because on the underside of the leaves and needles of conifer trees, you have these things called stomata, and that allows the gas exchange. It allows carbon dioxide in, and it allows oxygen out. But the coal smog pollution blocked up the stomata, so a lot of these trees died. But the London plane was one of the few that could actually survive. And the oldest trees in St James's Park were planted from this era, because every time there was a big landscape change in St James's Park, it ultimately ended up with most of the trees being cut down. And it was in this time that the trees along the Mall, Birdcage Walk, the plane trees of Green Park were planted. And the trees that we know along Birdcage Walk, they were actually the third line of the avenue in Green Park. So they were dug up from Green Park and transported to Birdcage Walk, where they were then planted. And this is what the tree carts were of the day. It was a triangle-shaped cart. The tree was loaded onto it, and then it was towed over by either a bull or a horse. And this was the predominant way of moving trees in the 19th century. So since then, very little has changed in the actual St James's Park, and all that's really changed is the nature of how the parks are used, with much more ceremonial events, military processions, where they've happened for over 300 years, major events like the London Marathon. But in terms of a 20th century context, we've seen a large increase of ornamental plantings. We've lost the elm trees because of Dutch elm. No significant redesign to the landscape, but part of the plantings have seen unusual trees such as the swamp cypress, paperbark maples, weeping beech trees, Pride of India, Italian maple, but also the continuation of trees of that heritage valley. So we've got disease-resistant elm trees planted in St James's Park, as well as hawthorn, still some mulberries, and we've got some odd ones such as the chimera of hawthorn and medlar. There are 3 of those just up here. Here, sorry, very unusual trees. But there is a move back to more native trees. So kind of the ornamental phase is kind of, it's not coming to an end, but there is a real resurgence in the demand for planting native trees, which is an interesting challenge for St James's Park, because it's a very small park. So you're limited on what you can plant, but also you can't really remove healthy trees to plant new trees, or at least you shouldn't. So it's interesting to see what the future kind of holds in terms of what new diseases come in or where we might be going. But one thing that I really wanted to show is there's a really fascinating website called Britain from Above, which is using aerial photography from the 1920s to the 1950s. And here is a 1921 image. So you can see Buckingham Palace, Victoria Borders, there's the Mall, and that's the lake, although you can see there's a covering over it. And during the First World War, the lake of St James's Park was drained, and it was used as like a military base. So that's quite fascinating. It's been really interesting actually seeing the size of the trees from these historic photos. So you can see the trees along the Mall, very, very small, but also, and this has been a really useful way of trying to date the ages. So these are all the big trees you can see in St James's Park. They're all London plane, and those trees are still there today. So it's quite a useful way of basically trying to age some of these trees. And then we move on to 1921. This sort of confused me a little bit, because we've got 2 photos from 1921, and one has got the lake covered and the other hasn't. Again, you can sort of see the trees down in Green Park on the left, as well as there are actually fewer trees in the 20s than there are now. But this image here, one of the more, now I'm sorry about this green line, if you can see that. I honestly don't know how that's emerged on the screen, bit strange one. But that's swamp cypress. So this tall tree here, this is one of the more notable tree features of St James's Park, and no one really knows how old it is. But I was looking for it in the aerial images, and if you look at the lake here, you can just about make out a few tree markings here, which could be. But look at the size of the trees along the Green Park Avenue, and we'll compare that to.
Greg, your sound's gone a bit.
It has it. Sorry, it's a standard microphone on.
Okay, that sounds better. That's good.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. So yeah, it's sort of looking at the growth sizes. So this is these trees been planted for only 10 years or so. Now you see the growth of the trees here, but also it's fascinating seeing what trees still exist today. And then, yeah, so this is 17 years later after the avenue of trees and Green Park planted. They're absolutely huge, and that's something like 100% success rate that they've got there. And yeah, this is planting of the 1910s or 1920s, putting to shame what we do today. So this is all from Britain from Above, which is a really, really fascinating website. And then here we go. So these here. So I think these trees here could be the very origins of those swamp cypress. And of course we've got trooping of the colour down the Mall, and then we've got those trees growing with it as well. And here's another image from 1950. So this is 2 years before the Queen's Jubilee. Again, trooping of the colour. You can see the growth size of the trees along the Mall. And yeah, this is something that I also found in trying to look into this, was actually the historic paintings, because there's something about trees in parks that really capture a lot of people's imaginations, and the majority of the paintings that you find of St James's Park are all focused on the trees. I mean, to be honest, it's kind of hard to do a painting of St James's Park and not get any trees on the canvas. But yeah, I sort of love with this one how Westminster Abbey is sort of framed by these trees, and my best guess is that these would be elm trees, and these sort of tall base. And obviously, in my lifetime, I've not been able to see what big mature English elms look like in real life, but based on photos and images, and this is very much these big trees here are what elm trees are supposed to look like, and that's very much part of the elm dominance of the landscape of those times. And yeah, so this is 1740, and I like to think that this area here is either, you know, emerging blackthorn or bramble, so a good throwback to the actual thorns of Thorny Island. Then this one I absolutely love. That's the actual name, fashionable people thronging in St James's Park. And what I love about this is, you know, you've got cattle grazing in St James's Park, which is, you know, quite remarkable thinking about what it's like today. But again, it's how these trees, which I'm convinced that elm trees are dominating the landscape here. So you've got Westminster Abbey in the background. This would be the modern day Horse Guards Parade. This here would be where the artillery memorial is. And I think here where these cattle are is where the park office would be. And we've got the Duke of York statue behind us. It's just how the trees are captured in all these images, I think, is brilliant. And yeah, it's perhaps the best way of trying to trace the tree history is actually looking at these historic paintings. And this is a view of the Mall in St James's Park from 1794. Completely different to how we know it now. I've been trying to picture where this actually could be along the Mall, and I can only assume it might be near the Duke of York steps, up near Admiralty Arch. I honestly can't think. But again, I think these are all elm trees, and I think this one here might be a lime. This is another view of St James's Park. The late 18th century seemed to be a very popular time to paint trees in St James's Park. Again, showing that dominance of the elm. And these sort of young conical trees planted over here. So this is, again, elm trees. This is the latter years of when you'd actually see the canal in the park. And this is kind of standing at the harbour wall, which is the big wall that separates St James's Park from the Victoria borders. So you're standing looking down the park with Buckingham Palace behind you. Again, a bit of a representation of how the canal would have looked, and then you've got sort of the roofs of Whitehall down here. And again, these are all sort of classic elm tree shapes as well. And then this is the ornamental water. Again, elm trees. This sort of shows how important elm trees were in the history of St James's Park that sadly we don't really see today. Bless you. I mean, the London plane is an absolutely wonderful sort of stature tree, but it doesn't have that quite the same as the elm. And then that was the last slide, sorry. So I've managed to keep it to sort of reasonable time. So if anybody wants to go to questions, then yeah, I open up to questions. And I handing back to Jules?
Yes. Down at the bottom of everyone's screen, we've got reactions. And click that and you get a little clap or a thumbs up. If anyone wants to ask a question, could they put a reaction? Okay, lovely. So Jonathan Fry up there. Okay, I will unmute. There we go. We should be able to hear you in a minute. Trying to unmute you. John.
I just wanted to say thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, like I said, it's been just the situation with work's been a nightmare. We lost our tree database IT system for about 6 weeks, and it's been a bit of a nightmare. So getting this planned has been a real challenge. So yeah, very glad you've enjoyed it all.
Okay, Greg, can you see Peter Roberts there?
I can.
I'm unmuting Peter. And Robert, these little clap things don't last that long. So
if not, you can always type the question into the chat box at the bottom, and I can answer it from there.
Okay, good idea. Let's go to Peter Roberts.
Thanks very much, Jules, and thank you, Greg, for your presentation. Early on in the presentation, you mentioned the Tyburn River. I know this is a bit off the tree subject, but it is very relevant to the park, it seems. The thing that confuses me a bit is that if you track a route of the Tyburn through Hyde Park and then down through St James's, as you suggested, that brings it out somewhere north of Westminster Bridge. But if you track along the banks of the River Thames, there is a plaque on the wall between Vauxhall Bridge, well, just south or west of Vauxhall Bridge, which says that that's where the Tyburn River comes out. That's a fair bit adrift. Do you have any idea why there might be that difference?
Yeah. So the true locations of it, I believe, were lost to time almost. There is a restaurant somewhere in London that claims to have the Tyburn flowing through it in its cellar, but yeah, I've never seen any real physical markers to where the river is. I'm just sort of going on what I've heard from other people who seem to know what they were talking about. So yeah, it's not a guaranteed location, because I honestly don't know. It's just something that I heard from someone in management about where the location was. So
okay,
yeah.
As I say, there is a plaque on the wall. It's a fairly recent plaque on the wall.
Okay.
If you track along from Vauxhall Bridge going westwards. But did you say there was some mark in Green Park related to the Tyburn?
Yeah, I don't think there's a physical plaque, but along the pathway there are some little raised ironwork mounds. That I was told, I forget who it was, but I was told by someone that was a marker to where the river allegedly was. But it's kind of, yeah.
Thanks very much. I'll check into that a bit further and let you know
cool.
if I come with any.
Our committee member Victor has done quite a bit of research on the delta of the Tyburn coming into the Thames. There is some stuff on our website as well. And we did a Green Park walk with the late Stephen Myers, and you can see a dip in Piccadilly of where the river probably crossed. It was really interesting standing in the dip and, you know, that being a possible waterway of old. But we've got lots of information about where the Tyburn and Thorny Island on our website, and I'll direct you there, Peter, another time.
I'll very quickly go back to screen share, and on the John Nash landscape plan, there is an actual water body in Green Park.
Yes.
Obviously, there isn't one there now, but I can only assume that the water came from somewhere. So somewhere in this region would be my best guess, but that is literally a best guess.
Yeah.
There's a question about the large fig tree on the northeast of the bridge. So I think that originated from kind of anywhere between the 1950s and 70s sort of plantings, but with fig trees, if you don't contain the roots when they're young, they can grow really huge, and that was just allowed to grow, a bit like the one in the southeast of the park. And they're actually, from what I understand, two of the largest fig trees in Britain. About 3 years ago, we had an email from an elderly Italian gentleman claiming that he wanted to know about the fig tree because it was quite a big fig tree when he came to the park in 1981 or 2, but they had to leave because his wife went into labour when they were there. So we sort of know from an email at the time that it was a decent sized tree in the early 80s. So yeah, I think probably 1950s or 60s planted, and it's just been allowed to grow. Okay, so when were fruit trees like cherry and pear planted? So they would have been planted, well, in the orchard, in the Andre Mollet designs of the 1660s, when there was an orchard, there would have been those trees planted in that orchard. But the younger ornamental ones have predominantly been planted in like the last sort of 20 or 30 years, really. But they're sort of, especially ornamental cherries, they're planted all the time now, ever since the 70s, really.
I think maybe Victor would like to say something. Victor?
So I can't find the chat box, unfortunately.
Okay.
On the Tyburn, there are the exit by Vauxhall Bridge one is an absolutely definite one going down from Buckingham Palace. Then the second leg of it going down to Westminster, the archaeologists are still sort of debating whether it was an actual river or whether it was the Thames coming back or whether it was lots of rivulets. And there's a third one at the end of Thorny Street, near where Burberry's head office is. There's an outlet there, and it's actually called Thorny Street and Thorny Stairs. And if you look over the side, there's actually an outlet to the Thames, which is only used now as an overflow. So the Tyburn still does run, though it gets mixed up with the sewage system. But I was going to ask a question that there's so many elm trees there, Greg, and they all disappeared with the disease. But you don't seem to see many plane trees among the elm trees. What happened there? Because it wasn't that long ago.
No, so right. Annoyingly, I'm going to go back onto screen share. Sorry, just to show you something. So this in Old and New London, Volume 4 from 1878, Westminster St James's Park. This is something that I only found about 4:30 today, and there is a reference in here a bit further down to an outbreak in the late 19th century of a Dutch elm-like disease that, yeah, that's one of those things that you find it and it's just too late. So, yeah, so I'm going by that as a reliable source. So I think there was a decline in the elm trees in the park at the end of the 19th century, and also kind of because of the success of London Plains and being established, that yeah, and also I sort of jokingly said about how late 1700s was popular for paintings. It's just what I was able to find in terms of artwork. There didn't seem to be a great deal actually from the late 19th century compared to the late 18th. So yeah, that's as much as I know on that. I think the elm trees started to decline.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any more questions? Mike Marriott put in the chat, thank you. The King's Scholars Ditch, of course, diverted the Tyburn just off Vauxhall Bridge Road there. A couple of people have had to leave. I wonder if I can easily, could everybody unmute themselves, do you think? And oh, someone wants to ask a question. I'm sorry, is it you, Carolyn?
I wanted to ask something, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Maybe I missed something, but the water in the pond, is that how is that replenished? I mean, is it just a pond, or is there some fresh water coming in?
Very good point. Very good point. Greg, and we know of a pump house, don't we, on Duck Island?
Yeah.
Used to circulate water coming all the way down, I think, from Kensington Gardens. Do you know more about that, Greg?
There is I'm trying to think off the top of my head now.
Sorry.
So is this after the First World War when the lake was drained, or part of the earlier?
I think the question is, where does the water come from that fills the lake today?
Oh right. Oh, okay. Yeah. I'm pretty sure the bottom of the lake is lined with concrete or something, because it's an artificially made lake. Yeah, I can't imagine it being pumped in from the Thames.
No,
there is.
I think it flows down from through Buckingham Palace as well, and there's. Yeah,
I think that it might, because that whole area is on a bit of a downward slope from Hyde Park. In the 1940s, the Luftwaffe wanted to bomb out Serpentine Bridge to flood Knightsbridge. So I think there is some underground water networks that does connect it.
Serpentine.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I can't give you a completely accurate answer, but that's.
But in the past, what happened in the past when they first made this artificial?
I think that they must have either redirected rivers or managed to get it in from the Thames. That would be my.
Sorry, it's not your.
Yeah, no. There has been a lot of research into like London's lost rivers. I'm pretty sure there's a book and a website on it.
Yeah, absolutely, there is.
Thank you.
Not one that I thought of.
Graham would like to say something. Hi, Graham.
Yes, just first of all, apologise for coming in very late. Had a meeting on planning. But on that point, Hugh Smith told us that the pump house on Duck Island originally pumped the water all the way up to the Serpentine and Kensington Gardens, and then that was no longer necessary when boreholes were built at Kensington Gardens and the Serpentine.
There's a lot of work that's gone into boreholes. Yes, yeah. Edward Strickland, if you've ever encountered Edward, he's spends most of his professional life looking for boreholes and digging up boreholes. So that's I completely forgot about that. Boreholes is probably the best answer we'll find on that.
Okay, lovely. And Sue, I just saw had held up a copy of Stephen Myers's book with Nicholas Bartlett, I think, The Lost Rivers of London. Yeah, all the rivers, and a nice big chapter on the Tyburn. Okay, any more questions? Okay, I think that might be it. Greg, we've had such a nice time. Thank you. Brilliant talk. Absolutely lovely, and loved all your slides and pictures. And thank you for your last minute afternoon research. Okay, hopefully clear. Really, really nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.